In the spring of 1942, the United States Navy sent out a plea that would have been humiliating if it had not been so desperate. The message went to every city, every town, every neighborhood in America. It appeared on posters in post offices, in advertisements in newspapers, on the radio. It said, in essence, we need your binoculars. Not the Navy's binoculars, yours. The pair you keep in the hall closet for bird watching, the pair your father brought back from Europe, the German-made Zeiss glasses you use at the horse races, the opera glasses your wife takes to the theater. The Navy was asking private American citizens to loan or sell for $1 their personal binoculars to the federal government because the United States military did not have enough to equip the men who were fighting and dying at sea. Lookouts on destroyers needed binoculars to spot submarines before the submarines spotted them. Gunners on merchant ships needed binoculars to identify approaching aircraft, friend or enemy, in the minutes before the aircraft was close enough to kill them. Officers on cruisers and battleships needed binoculars for navigation, for fire control, for the 1,000 tasks of seamanship that require seeing farther than the naked eye allows. And there were not enough binoculars to go around. The shortage was not a minor procurement inconvenience. It was a crisis that was costing lives. A lookout without binoculars is a man squinting at the horizon. A U-boat periscope is a needle-thin line against the gray Atlantic swell. Without magnification, that line is invisible at any practical distance. By the time a lookout with naked eyes sees a torpedo wake, it is too late. The ship is already dead. America, the most industrialized nation on Earth, the nation that produced more steel, more automobiles, more aircraft, more of anything than any country in history, could not make binoculars. Not in 1942. The precision optical manufacturing capacity did not exist at the scale the war demanded. Before Pearl Harbor, American production of military-grade binoculars amounted to only a few thousand per year, almost all of them from a single company, Bausch & Lomb in Rochester, New York. The rest of the world's great optical manufacturers, Zeiss, Leitz, Hensoldt, were German. They were the enemy. The solution came from the most unlikely place imaginable, not from an optics company, not from a precision instrument maker, from a factory in Mansfield, Ohio that made refrigerators. The Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company had been in Mansfield, Ohio since 1917. Over 24 years, the plant had grown from 125 employees to 5,000, and its local payroll had expanded from $125,000 to $9.5 million per year. The factory had become the economic heart of Mansfield, the largest employer, the biggest taxpayer, the institution around which the city's identity was built. What Westinghouse built in Mansfield was refrigerators, millions of them. By 1941, the plant had produced over 2 million appliances, refrigerators, ranges, water heaters, sold under the Westinghouse brand through advertisements in the Saturday Evening Post, Life magazine, and every major publication in America. The return address at the bottom of every Westinghouse appliance advertisement directed customers to Mansfield, Ohio. The city and the refrigerator were inseparable. In January 1941, the United States government curtailed production of household refrigerators by 55%. The metallic materials, steel, copper, aluminum, that went into appliances were being reprioritized for defense production. Tanks, bombers, battleships. The country was not yet at war, but the industrial mobilization was already underway. For Mansfield, the announcement was devastating. The curtailment came just as Westinghouse had reached an all-time high in appliance production, with a record number of employees on the payroll. 700 workers were furloughed overnight. For people who had lived through the Great Depression, who remembered the staggering unemployment of the 1930s, who had seen their neighbors lose their homes and their dignity, a layoff looked like the beginning of another catastrophe. It was not. It was the beginning of something no one in Mansfield had imagined. On April 27, 1942, the last pre-war refrigerator rolled off the Westinghouse production line in Mansfield. It was stamped with the serial number 2,058,334. Every worker on the line signed it. Then, in a gesture that captured both the pride and sacrifice of the moment, the refrigerator was donated to the American Red Cross for use in their blood bank program. 2,058,334 refrigerators. That was the sum total of what Mansfield had built in peacetime. Now the line was stomping. The metal that had gone into refrigerator compressors and door panels and shelving would go into other things. The workers who had assembled appliances for American kitchens would assemble something very different. The government and Westinghouse had been planning the conversion for months. Even before Pearl Harbor, engineers had been studying the Mansfield plant to determine what it could produce for the war effort. The factory's machinery was precise. Refrigerator production required tight tolerances and consistent quality control. The workforce was skilled. They understood assembly line methods, could read blueprints, and were accustomed to working with metal to exacting specifications. And the plant was large. Building H, the main production floor, had the space and infrastructure to support a new manufacturing operation. The question was, what should that operation be? The answer came from the Navy, and it came with the urgency of a war that America was losing. The American binocular crisis of 1942 had roots that stretched back decades. Precision optics, binoculars, telescopes, rangefinders, periscopes, bomb sights require specialized glass, precision grinding, and assembly techniques that are closer to watchmaking than to heavy manufacturing. Before the war, the global center of optical excellence was Germany, and the gap between German and everyone else was not a matter of degree, it was a chasm. Carl Zeiss in Jena had been producing the world's finest optical instruments since the 1840s. The company employed some of the greatest minds in optics. Ernst Abbe, who developed the mathematical theory of microscope resolution, worked there. Otto Schott, whose glassworks produced over 200 types of specialized optical glass, was Zeiss's neighbor and collaborator in Jena. Ernst Leitz in Wetzlar produced the Leica camera and military rangefinders of legendary quality. Hensoldt made binoculars and telescopic sights that were considered the world standard. The German advantage was not merely commercial, it was military. German U-boat commanders peered through Zeiss periscopes. German naval lookouts scanned the Atlantic with 7x50 binoculars whose coated optics gathered light so efficiently that they could spot targets in twilight conditions where uncoated American glasses showed nothing but gray. German snipers used Zeiss telescopic sights that allowed them to kill at ranges that seemed impossible to their victims. The optical glass, the precision grinding, and the anti-reflective coatings that Zeiss had pioneered, these were not luxuries, they were force multipliers. A man who can see farther than his enemy can shoot first. In the United States, the optical industry was small. Bausch & Lomb in Rochester, New York, was the only American manufacturer with the capability to produce military-grade optics in significant quantity. Spencer Optical in Buffalo, Universal Camera in New York, and a handful of smaller firms contributed, but the total American production capacity for precision binoculars was a fraction of what the military would need. This was not a new problem. The story of military optical crises stretches back to 1914, and it is worth telling because America in 1942 was repeating history almost exactly. In the First World War, Britain faced what contemporaries called the glass famine. The British Empire, the largest military power on Earth, entered the war dependent on Germany for roughly 2/3 of its precision optics. Carl Zeiss in Jena and the Schott Glass Works provided the lenses, the prisms, the telescopic sights that British officers, artillery spotters, and snipers needed to fight. When the war began and those imports were cut off overnight, the consequences were immediate and lethal. British soldiers were sent to the trenches without binoculars. German snipers, equipped with Zeiss telescopic sights ground from shot optical glass, killed British officers at ranges that the British could barely see. The technology gap was not theoretical, it was measured in bodies. The British scrambled to build their own optical capacity, but precision lens grinding is not a skill that can be learned in weeks. The gap persisted for years. The crisis became so desperate that the British government sent an agent to Switzerland to explore the possibility of purchasing optical instruments from Germany through neutral intermediaries, buying the enemy's technology to use against the enemy. The public was asked to donate binoculars, telescopes, opera glasses, anything with lenses. Even King George V and Queen Mary donated their personal binoculars. By 1918, Britain had built a domestic optical industry sufficient for its needs. But the lesson that dependence on a potential enemy for a critical military technology is a strategic vulnerability was apparently forgotten by the time the Americans needed to learn it for themselves. America, in 1942, was repeating Britain's 1914 experience. The Navy's binocular campaign, Eyes for the Navy, was a direct echo of the British appeal, and it carried the same mixture of patriotism and desperation. Citizens were asked to bring their binoculars to collection points at post offices, courthouses, and Navy recruitment stations. The Navy paid $1 per instrument, a token amount, since a quality pair of Zeiss 7x50 binoculars cost $30 or $40 even in the 1930s. But the Navy was not legally authorized to accept free gifts or unpaid loans, so the $1 purchase was a bureaucratic workaround that everyone understood was symbolic. Each accepted binocular was cleaned, calibrated, and collimated, the process of aligning the two optical axes so that both barrels produce a single, merged image. The left prism cover was engraved with Bureau of Ships, a unique serial number, and the year of acceptance. The right prism cover was engraved with the name of the donor. This was a deliberate gesture. The Navy wanted every donor to know that their binoculars could be identified, tracked, and theoretically returned after the war. The response was enormous and deeply personal. Families donated binoculars that had been wedding gifts, graduation presents, or souvenirs from European vacations. Bird watchers surrendered their Zeiss glasses. Opera enthusiasts gave up their theater glasses. One woman in New York donated a pair inscribed with her husband's name. He had been killed at Pearl Harbor, and she wanted his binoculars to help avenge him. Thousands of instruments poured into the Naval Observatory in Washington. Not all were usable. Opera glasses, toy binoculars, and instruments with fewer than 6-power magnification were rejected, but those that passed inspection went directly to ships. During the First World War, a similar campaign had collected 51,217 instruments, of which 31,000 were accepted for naval use. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy who signed the thank you letters was a young man named Franklin D. Roosevelt, the same man who, as president, now presided over a Navy that needed binoculars again for a Second World War 24 years later. Thousands were collected, but donated civilian binoculars could not solve the problem. The Navy needed hundreds of thousands of purpose-built military instruments, rugged, waterproof, individually focusing, with reticles for range estimation and fire control. The civilian donations bought time. They did not buy victory. For that, the Navy needed a factory. And of all the 25 Westinghouse plants across the United States, the company believed that Mansfield had the best resources, the best workforce, and the best infrastructure to take on the most delicate manufacturing contract of the war. The conversion of Building H from a refrigerator assembly line to a binocular production facility was one of the more remarkable industrial transformations of the Second World War. The fundamental challenge was dust. A speck of lint inside a binocular, invisible to the naked eye, smaller than a grain of sand, will appear as a dark blot in the field of view. A hair, a fiber from a cotton shirt, a particle of face powder will distort the image that a lookout depends on to spot a submarine at 3 miles. Refrigerator assembly tolerates a certain amount of airborne contamination. Optical assembly does not. Westinghouse invested approximately $2 million in converting Building H. The air handling system was redesigned from scratch. A custom filtration system, unprecedented in scale for a manufacturing facility of this size, removed particulate matter from the air to a standard that approached laboratory conditions. The temperature and humidity were controlled to prevent the expansion and contraction of metal and glass components that could throw off the precise alignment of the optical elements. The 700 workers who had been furloughed from the refrigerator line were recalled, but they returned to a factory they barely recognized. The production floor was immaculate. The air smelled different, filtered, controlled, sterile, and the dress code had changed. Every worker in Building H was required to wear specially starched clothing, white dresses for the women, white coveralls for the men, so stiff that the fabric could not shed fibers or collect dust. The starching process was precise. Too little starch and the fabric would release lint, too much and it would crack and produce its own particles. The women of Building H were also prohibited from wearing makeup. No powder, no mascara, no lipstick with a powdery finish. Cosmetic particles were among the most insidious contaminants in an optical assembly environment, fine enough to pass through standard air filters, small enough to settle on a lens surface and remain invisible until the binocular was held up to the light. Newspaper reporters tried to make a human interest story out of the no makeup rule, framing it as a sacrifice comparable to the rationing of sugar or gasoline. The women of Building H rejected the comparison. As one worker told the Mansfield News Journal in 1942, "Soldiers going to battle is true sacrifice. Women going without mascara is a relief." A military binocular is not a simple device. The standard American WW2 binocular, the M3 6x30, consisted of two parallel optical systems, each containing an objective lens, a pair of Poro prisms, and an eyepiece lens, all mounted in a precision-machined aluminum alloy body connected by a calibrated hinge. The 6x30 designation means 6-power magnification with a 30mm objective lens. 6-power makes a target at 600 yards appear as if it were at 100. The 30mm objective gathers enough light for effective use in twilight conditions, critical for naval lookouts who must maintain watch from dawn through dusk and beyond. The Poro prisms, two right-angle glass prisms in each barrel, arranged to fold the light path and invert the image, are the components that give binoculars their characteristic wide-body shape. Each prism must be ground to precise angular tolerances and mounted with exact alignment. A misalignment of a fraction of a degree will cause the two optical systems to produce images that do not merge properly, creating double vision, eye strain, and uselessness. Westinghouse manufactured the metal components, the bodies, the hinge assemblies, the focusing mechanisms, the prism housings, using the precision machining capabilities that had been developed for refrigerator compressor production. The tolerances were demanding. The screw machine that produced binocular components operated to 0.7 of a thousandth of an inch. One automatic tool performed 23 separate operations on each part, producing 60 finished components per hour. The optical elements, the lenses and prisms, were supplied primarily by Bausch & Lomb and other optical specialists. Westinghouse was not a lens maker. It was a precision metal fabricator and assembler. The genius of the arrangement was recognizing that the bottleneck in binocular production was not glass. Bausch & Lomb and other optical companies could produce lenses and prisms at scale, but the metalwork, the assembly, and the quality control. These were exactly the capabilities that a refrigerator factory possessed. The result was a division of labor that multiplied production capacity beyond anything the pre-war optical industry could have achieved alone. Bausch & Lomb made the glass, Westinghouse made the metal, assembled the instruments, and tested them.
Nash Kelvinator, another appliance manufacturer, maker of refrigerators and washing machines, was given a parallel contract and performed the same transformation at its own facilities. Between them, these appliance companies produced hundreds of thousands of military binoculars in a time frame that would have been impossible for the traditional optical industry.
Westinghouse was not alone. The Navy and Army cast their net across the entire American appliance industry, looking for any manufacturer with the precision machining capability and clean room potential to produce military optics. Nash Kelvinator Corporation, manufacturer of Nash automobiles and Kelvinator refrigerators and home appliances, received a parallel binocular production contract. Like Westinghouse, Nash Kelvinator had no experience in optics. Like Westinghouse, it had decades of experience in precision metalwork, assembly line production, and quality control. The conversion followed the same pattern. Appliance production ceased, factory floors were renovated for dust-free assembly, workers were retrained, and binoculars began rolling off lines that had previously produced iceboxes. The symmetry was striking. Two refrigerator companies, rivals in the pre-war appliance market, were now producing the same military product, M3 by 30 binoculars, to the same specifications, using the same Bosch and Lomb optical components for the same military customer. The competitive instincts that had driven them to outsell each other in department stores were now channeled into outproducing each other for the Army and Navy. Other companies joined the optical production effort as well. Universal Camera Corporation in New York assembled binoculars for both the Army and the Marine Corps. Spencer Optical in Buffalo produced naval binoculars. Colesman Instruments, known as SARD, assembled binoculars in Flushing, Queens. Anchor Optical contributed additional capacity. The entire American manufacturing base was mobilized to solve a problem that, in peacetime, had been left to a single company in Rochester. The result was a production miracle, measured in precision glass and machined aluminum. An industry that had produced a few thousand binoculars per year before the war was now producing hundreds of thousands, and the quality, verified by Army and Navy inspectors at every facility, met or exceeded the standards of the European instruments they replaced. Before Pearl Harbor, American production of military binoculars amounted to a few thousand per year. By the end of 1942, less than a year after the conversion of Building H, the Mansfield plant had shipped 100,000 pairs of binoculars to the Navy. 100,000 precision optical instruments, each one tested, calibrated, and certified for military use, produced by workers who 12 months earlier had been assembling refrigerators. The first 100,000 went to the Navy as an emergency allocation. After the immediate naval crisis was addressed, subsequent production was distributed to the Army. Binoculars from Mansfield went to every branch of the service, in every theater of the war. The M3 6x30 became the standard infantry and artillery binocular. The M15 and M17 7x50, larger, heavier instruments with wider objectives for better low-light performance, went to naval observers and anti-aircraft batteries. Total wartime production of the M3 alone exceeded 311,000 units, with Westinghouse and Nash Kelvinator as the primary manufacturers. Including the M13, M13A1, M15, and M17 variants, hundreds of thousands more were produced. The price per unit was $71 to $72, a fraction of what handmade European instruments cost, achieved through the mass production methods that American appliance manufacturers had perfected over decades of building consumer goods. The Westinghouse year-end report for 1942, documenting over $500 million in war material delivered to the military, stated the transformation in corporate language that barely concealed the pride behind it. One Westinghouse plant, a peacetime manufacturer of electrical appliances, had transformed the production of binoculars for the nation's armed forces from a handcraft art to mass output with no loss in precision. The new field glasses had the additional advantage of having fully interchangeable parts, a feature that European handmade binoculars did not offer and that dramatically simplified field maintenance and repair. The binocular department was predominantly staffed by women. This was not accidental. The assembly of precision optical instruments requires dexterity, patience, and an ability to perform repetitive, fine motor tasks with unwavering consistency, qualities that the manufacturing industry of the 1940s associated, correctly or not, with female workers. The women of Building H cleaned lenses with tiny vacuum instruments that removed dust particles the way a household vacuum cleaned a parlor rug. They aligned prisms using optical test fixtures. They assembled focusing mechanisms with screwdrivers calibrated to deliver precise torque. They inspected finished instruments through collimators that verified alignment to fractions of an arc minute. They did this in starched white dresses, without makeup, in filtered air, for 8-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The home front manufacturing effort was regarded by the military as no less important than combat service. It was known in wartime headlines as the production offensive. Associated Press photographs of the Mansfield binocular workers, women in white, bent over benches covered with gleaming optical components, appeared in newspapers from coast to coast. The images carried a message that was both inspirational and practical. The war was being won not only on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. Westinghouse workers discovered innovations that improved both efficiency and quality. Women in the binocular department found that wrapping parts in diapers, soft, lint-free cloth originally manufactured for infant use, protected optical components during assembly better than the industrial wrapping materials that had been specified. The discovery was reported by the Associated Press and picked up by newspapers nationwide. Another worker developed a method using thread bobbins as holders for small optical components during the coating process, improving handling efficiency without risking contamination. These were not the dramatic breakthroughs of a laboratory. They were the small, practical improvements that emerge when skilled workers are given a problem and the freedom to solve it. Cumulatively, they made the difference between a production line that met its quotas and one that exceeded them. As the war progressed, the science of military optics advanced rapidly, and some of the innovations that emerged from wartime research would transform civilian optics for decades to come. One of the most significant was anti-reflective coating. Untreated glass reflects approximately 4% of the light that strikes each surface. In a binocular with multiple lens elements and prism surfaces, these reflections accumulate, reducing the total light transmission to as little as 50%. The lost light appears as internal reflections, ghost images, and reduced contrast that degrade the view, particularly in low light conditions. German optical scientists, working under Alexander Smokula at Zeiss, had developed magnesium fluoride anti-reflective coatings in the 1930s. Applied as a thin film under heat and vacuum, the coating reduced surface reflections to less than 1%, dramatically improving light transmission and image contrast. The Germans mass-produced coated binoculars primarily for their navy, giving Kriegsmarine lookouts a significant advantage in the low light conditions of dawn, dusk, and overcast Atlantic weather. American and British scientists developed their own coating processes during the war. By 1944, most American military binoculars were being manufactured with coated optics. The Westinghouse plant in Mansfield incorporated the coating process into its production line, adding another layer of technical sophistication to a facility that had been making refrigerators 3 years earlier. The Associated Press carried a story, reprinted in dozens of newspapers, about a related wartime discovery.
Researchers found that giving workers vitamin A supplements improved their ability to detect flaws in optical glass during inspection because vitamin A enhances visual acuity in low light conditions. The headline read, "Vitamins to help make Army binoculars." The war had reached the point where even the diet of factory workers was being optimized for military production.
On July 14, 1943, the Westinghouse plant in Mansfield received the Army-Navy E Award, the highest recognition given to industrial facilities for excellence in wartime production. The ceremony was held in the parking lot at the corner of Wayne and 4th Streets in front of the Westinghouse office building that had been only 4 years old when the war began. A flight of 5 Navy Corsair fighters, the same aircraft that Mansfield workers were producing components for, dove out of the sun, buzzed the crowd, wagged their wings, and roared off over Ashland Hill. The crowd of workers, families, military officials, and local dignitaries watched in silence for a moment, then erupted in cheers. Those planes contained parts made by their hands. The binoculars carried by the pilots had been assembled by their colleagues in Building H. The connection between the factory floor and the cockpit was not abstract. It was tangible. It was real. Every employee received a commemorative booklet and a certificate. The ceremony was covered by local and national press. Mansfield had gone from a city that made refrigerators to a city that made victory. The plant also produced components for the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, parts of the airframe that had been manufactured using repurposed refrigerator production equipment. Another section of the factory produced components for the Navy F-4U Corsair. Binoculars were the most visible product, but the Mansfield Works was contributing to the war effort across multiple programs simultaneously. When the fighting ended, the binocular contracts were canceled and the refrigerator line restarted. Mansfield went back to making appliances. The white dresses were packed away. The makeup went back on. The air filtration system that had kept Building H cleaner than a hospital operating room was repurposed or removed. But the binoculars survived. Westinghouse WW2 binoculars, stamped with Westinghouse and a date on the right prism cover with the mysterious initials HMR that may indicate an Army inspection officer or high moisture resistance, are among the most sought-after military collectibles in the world. They appear regularly at auctions, in militaria shops, and in the collections of optical historians. They are sturdy, functional, and, with their Bausch & Lomb glass elements and Westinghouse precision metalwork, still capable of delivering a clear, bright image more than 80 years after they were manufactured. Some of these binoculars saw action on the bridge of a destroyer in the North Atlantic, scanning for U-boat periscopes. Some were carried by infantry officers in the hedgerows of Normandy. Some were used by artillery forward observers in the mountains of Italy, calling fire onto German positions from ridgelines where a clear view meant the difference between accurate fire and wasted shells. A famous wartime poster shows General Eisenhower himself using binoculars, and the instruments in the image are Westinghouse lenses from Mansfield, Ohio. The broader wartime optical production effort, of which the Westinghouse binoculars were one part, permanently transformed the American optical industry. Before the war, the United States depended on German imports for the majority of its precision optics. After the war, American optical manufacturing was self-sufficient. The techniques developed during the war, anti-reflective coatings, mass production of precision prisms, and interchangeable parts assembly became the foundation of the post-war American optical industry. Every pair of binoculars, every rifle scope, every camera lens manufactured in America after 1945 benefited from the production methods and optical science that the war had forced into existence. Here is what the Westinghouse binoculars teach. They teach that industrial conversion, the ability to transform a factory from one product to another in weeks or months, is itself a weapon. The German optical industry was superb, but it was specialized. Zeiss made optics. Zeiss did not make refrigerators. When the war demanded optical production beyond Zeiss's capacity, Germany had no reserve of precision manufacturing capability to draw upon. America did. The same skills that built a refrigerator compressor, precision machining, tight tolerances, quality control, assembly line discipline, could build a binocular. The workers who had spent years making appliances already understood the fundamental principles. They needed only to be pointed at a new target. They teach that the most important wartime innovations are often not technological, but organizational. The technology of the M3 binocular was not revolutionary. It was a Poro prism design that had existed since the 1890s. What was revolutionary was producing it in a converted appliance factory with interchangeable parts at a rate of thousands per month, using workers who had never seen a binocular before the war. The innovation was not in the optics. It was in the production. They teach that women built the war. The women of Building H, in their starched white dresses, without their makeup, handling optical components with vacuum instruments and calibrated screwdrivers, produced the instruments that gave American forces the ability to see the enemy before the enemy saw them. They did not fire a shot. They did not fly a mission. They aligned prisms and cleaned lenses and inspected finished binoculars hour after hour, day after day, until 100,000 pairs of eyes were ready for war. And they teach that the gap between a refrigerator and a weapon is smaller than you think. Both require precision. Both require quality control. Both require skilled workers and good machinery and a factory floor organized for efficiency. The difference is intent. The same hands that assembled a thermostat for an icebox assembled a focusing mechanism for a binocular. The same eyes that inspected a compressor seal inspected a prism alignment. The same factory that kept food cold kept men alive. Refrigerator number 2,058,334, the last one, signed by every worker on the line, donated to the Red Cross, sits at the hinge point of this story. Before it, appliances for American kitchens. After it, optics for American warriors. The number is precise because precision is what Mansfield did. The signatures are there because the workers knew they were signing the end of one era and the beginning of another. The binoculars they built after that last refrigerator are still out there, in museums, in collections, in the attics of veterans' grandchildren. Pick one up, hold it to your eyes, look through Westinghouse glass at a distant hillside and see it sharp and clear, 80 years later. That clarity was manufactured by women in white dresses in a dust-free room in Ohio, in a factory that smelled of filtered air and starched cotton instead of the refrigerant and solder it had known for 24 years. They stopped making refrigerators. They started making victory. And the view through those lenses is still clear.